Yes. Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you all to the University of Adelaide, and I can still say that for the next couple of weeks, but not any longer after that. To the fifth in the Alan Reid lecture series, the fifth annual lecture that Professor Alan Reid is giving on political parties and democracy. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Kaurna people, and pay respects to their ancestors, their elders, and emerging leaders and all members of that community. I'd like also to acknowledge the many guests that we have here, in particular Her Excellency the Honourable Francis Adamson, Governor of South Australia, and Mr. Rod Bunton. There are many distinguished guests here, and I've got a long list of former members of parliament, of former ministers, and I'm sure they will forgive me for not reading out their names one by one, but I'd like to extend our welcome to them all. Also, John Williams, Professor John Williams, AM, FASSA, Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. I'll call on him soon to introduce Alan Reid. Before I do, however, I just wanted to make one little announcement. This event is being co-hosted by the History Trust of South Australia and the Stretton Institute at the University of Adelaide. The Stretton Institute won't continue in the new amalgamated university, but the one major event that we have, the Hugh Stretton Oration, will continue. And I'd like to announce that the Hugh Stretton Oration for 2026 will be given on the 15th of April by Stephen Mulligan. Stephen Mulligan has recently stepped down as Treasurer of South Australia, and obviously has a huge amount of policy experience, and it'll be a very, very interesting oration. You'll get more notice about it later on, but April the 15th, Stephen Mulligan in the Elder Hall at the new university. But tonight, we're looking back. We're looking back, and I'd like to introduce Professor John Williams, Provost of the University of Adelaide, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic of Adelaide University, to introduce Alan. John.
Your Excellency, Mr. Bunton, colleagues and friends, I have three jobs here this evening. First, to introduce our distinguished lecturer, then to make some brief observations on the presentation, and then hand over to the Chair of the History Trust. So let me commence with my first role. I'd like to obviously welcome Professor Reid to us. Alan Reid is the Professor Emeritus of Education at the University of South Australia, where he's held numerous positions, including the Dean of Education, the Director of Research Centres, and a Professor of Education. He's a leading figure in significant education policy development in the state and nationally. His research and writing on education is focused on curricula, research policy, education policy, and history of politics of public education, and education and democracy. Over the past 4 years, he has been working on this project of South Australian premieres and the development of democracy in our state. And each year he's presented a public lecture on the era of South Australian political history. Alan chairs Democracy 36, which he recently released, the Charter for a Democratic Renewal in South Australia, designed for community consultation about the ideas for advancing democracy in our state and beyond. He's completed his term, or is recently completing his term on the History Trust of South Australia and is currently a member of the Education Innovation Council for the Department of Education. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our distinguished lecturer.
Thanks very much, John. And can I start by thanking the History Trust and the Stretton Institute for supporting this lecture this year, and particular thanks to Rebecca and Suzanne and Jade for their organisation. It's been great. And thanks very much to all of you for coming. It is really great to see such an interest in South Australian stories set in a sort of national, regional and global context. So it's great to see you here, and thanks for turning up. As John said, this is the 5th in a lecture series where I'm tracking some of the key moments in the development of democracy in South Australia and exploring these through the lives and contributions of our political leaders, the premiers. As you know, there's currently widespread concern about what's happening to democracy in a number of countries around the world. Australia still has a comparatively healthy democracy, but there are signs of some emerging dangers. And if our democracy is to stay healthy and to flourish, then it needs to be kept under constant review so that changes can be made when and where they're needed. History has an important role to play in that process. For example, history can demonstrate that the democratic structures and processes that we have today have not always been there. They've been shaped over time and have been achieved through struggles over contesting ideas about what comprises a democracy. Using South Australia as a case study, this lecture will make that point again, drawing on 2 aspects of representative democracy from the period 1901 to 1912. So the first aspect is political parties, which have evolved into the major means by which political representation is organised and managed in most representative democracies. In Australia, it's taken the form of the dominant 2-party system, which has operated for over a century. And today, the purposes and role of political parties are under scrutiny as their membership and their primary vote are in decline. Will they recover and survive in their current form, or are there other possibilities? Tonight's lecture will look at how the organisation of political representation played out over 120 years ago in South Australia, resulting in the formation of 2 major political parties. The second aspect that we're going to look at is who gets the right to vote for our parliamentary representatives. Over the period of our democratic history, there have been groups who have been excluded from voting based on such factors as age, sex, wealth, culture and residency time. Any history of democracy contains stories about how particular groups campaigned to win the franchise. Last year we looked at how South Australian women were the first in Australia to win the right to vote in 1894. And as I cover the 20th century and future lectures, we'll explore the ongoing campaign by First Peoples to win the vote, which was so shamefully denied to them by the new Commonwealth Parliament in 1902, even though they had the franchise for elections for the South Australian Parliament. In the lecture tonight, I'm going to focus on the battle for the right to vote in Legislative Council elections in South Australia, which raged for well over 100 years, but was particularly fierce in the first decade of the 20th century. Now, as I explore these 2 democratic issues, I'll introduce the premiers from the period 1901 to 1912. It'll close the loop for the first 5 lectures. Those who attended the first lecture may remember that I showed this image of the 24 South Australian premiers from 1857 to 1909. And as we observed then, as observed every year since, they've all been men. And the first 2 in this lecture, we're going to cover the last 3 there. Can you see right at the bottom? Jenkins, Butler and Price. And we'll look at the first 2 of the remaining 23 premiers of the 47 premiers we've had, again, all men, Archibald Peake and John Verran. So after this lecture, there'll be 21 to go, over halfway. But yes, it is a race against time. So During the period from 1901 to 1912, the two democracy themes are so entangled, and the political groupings and parties, premiers and attempts to enlarge the franchise come and go so frequently that I faced a kind of pedagogical challenge in preparing the lecture. How can I describe these in a coherent and understandable way? So in the end, I found myself dividing the story into parts, like the acts of a play, which helped me to sort the material. So I wrote my lecture as a kind of treatment for a 3-act play with a prologue, and fortunately I've got the epilogue, but that'll be Professor John Williams, and a 3-act play with a prologue and an epilogue. And I hope that approach will help you make sense of the story. So the story is set in South Australia in the first 12 years of the 20th century. In 1901, the population of South Australia was approximately 360,000, and by the end of the decade it grew to about 420,000, with about half the population living in Adelaide. Wheat and wool were still the mainstay of the economy. Mining was less dominant than it had been in the 19th century, and manufacturing, including food processing, agricultural machinery and building materials, was growing slowly. By 1900 in Adelaide, there were some grand stone buildings like the General Post Office, the Town Hall and the Exhibition Building. There was a lively commercial centre with Rundle, Hindley and King William Streets at its heart. And there had been a gradual spread of villages and suburbs along connecting roads and horse-drawn tram lines. The first decade of the 20th century saw the start of some remarkable changes in the infrastructure servicing this development, including energy supply and public transport. In 1899, Parliament authorised private companies to build power stations and organise electricity supply. And in 1901, a new coal-fired power generator in Grenfell Street was built, which in 1904 became the Adelaide Electric Supply Company. Over the next few years, transmission spread into the suburbs for home use and street lighting, taking over from gas lighting. And as distribution expanded, so too did the plant, a second story being added in 1912. Of course, today, most of you will recognise that houses Tandanya. Knowledge about electricity was also used in the development of telephones, which from the 1880s had slowly begun to supplement the telegraph system and continued from 1900 onwards. In the same decade, electricity was used to solve a problem that bedevilled cities all over the world. Before this decade, horses were one of the major forms of transport being used for a variety of private and public purposes, including carrying passengers in horse-drawn trams, cabs and omnibuses. By 1900, horse-drawn trams were being criticised for being slow and cumbersome and for the smell and mess of having about 1,000 horses, each depositing 10 to 15 pounds of manure every day on streets around the city. Until 1900, the only answer was the use of young boys, scavenger boys they were called, employed to remove the manure and cart it away, which was expensive. The use of electric traction for trams provided an answer, and in 1909, the first electric tram line began operation in Adelaide, and the system slowly expanded over the next few years. By 1901, petrol-powered motor cars were being imported into South Australia, and they too contributed to solving the horse manure problem, not to mention speeding up transport time. At first, it was only the wealthy who could afford them, and growth was slow. But by 1910, there were nearly 1,200 registered cars in South Australia. And some of the foodies here might recognise that building at the back, which is currently the Lenzerheide restaurant. That was the surgery of Dr. Arthur Galt and his first car. As these new forms of energy and transport appeared between 1900 and 1912, the streetscape slowly changed, with the old sitting alongside the new. And I've chosen these two photos from 1909, 1910 to illustrate this point in relation to transport, where horse drays and horse-drawn trams are sharing the road with electric trams and cars. Some well-known names were living and working in South Australia in this decade, and no doubt using the horse-drawn trams and electric trams. They included scientists like William Bragg and his son Lawrence Bragg, after whom this lecture theatre is named, who were based in Adelaide for most of the decade before going on to win the 1915 Nobel Prize for Science. Social activists and writers like Mary Lee, who was such a central figure in the suffragist movement in South Australia and continued social work well into this decade until her death in 1909, and Muriel Matters, who was educated in Adelaide and was to play such an important role in the Women's Freedom League in England from 1908, famously handcuffing herself to the grill in the House of Commons, and then going up in an airship and dropping leaflets over parts of London. Fiction and non-fiction writer, suffragist and social reformer Catherine Spence, and journalist and poet C.J. Dennis, who during this decade was editor for journals like The Gadfly and Critic, before going on later to write his famous Songs of the Sentimental Bloke. Artists like Margaret Preston and her students, such as Stella Bowen and Gladys Raynell, who went on to make their names in Europe in the following decade. Scientists and explorers like geologist, academic and Antarctic explorer Douglas Mawson, based at the University of Adelaide, and of course explorer, pilot, geographer and photographer Hubert Wilkins, who during this decade was studying at the School of Mines and Industry before heading off in 1908 to his now well-known adventures. And finally, sports people such as the Australian Test cricket captains Joe Darling and Clem Hill. Just give me a bit of a glimpse into South Australia at this time. The Commonwealth of Australia was inaugurated at Centennial Park, Sydney on January the 1st, 1901, with the first Parliament opening on May the 9th, 1901 in Melbourne. Standing in the exhibition building in Melbourne were the first 13 South Australians elected to the House of Representatives and Senate, including 5 former premiers. But it was not only a change in people that made for a very different post-Federation South Australian Parliament. Federation meant that South Australia moved from being one of a number of self-governing British colonies operating separately within the British Empire to being a state of the Commonwealth of Australia, retaining its own state government and parliament, but transferring certain responsibilities such as defence and trade, post and telegraph and immigration to the new federal government. One of the first things the new state government did in 1901 too was to introduce a bill to account for these changes. After lots of debate, a new Constitution Act reduced the House of Assembly from 54 members to 42 and the Legislative Council from 24 members to 18. So when we had our first state election after Federation, there were 18 fewer parliamentary places. And in addition, the number of ministers reduced from 6 to 4. So these were kind of effects that it had on South Australian politics. Now I want to start by giving a little bit of background to the Legislative Council debates. And to do that, we need to go back 50 years from this time, from 1901, go back 50 years to 1851, when the Imperial Parliament agreed to let South Australia establish a partly elected, partly nominated Legislative Council to assist the Governor in governing the colony and to develop a constitution for responsible government. The 8 nominated and 16 elected members met between 1851 and 1856 in what we now call Old Parliament House. Actually, it was added to over that time. That's the finished version of the Old Parliament House. But what they were discussing, apart from the governance of the colony at the time, was what should be contained in the Constitution. Okay, tabula rasa, in a sense, a new Constitution. There was broad agreement that South Australia should have a bicameral parliament, a lower house called the House of Assembly and an upper house called the Legislative Council, like the House of Commons and the House of Lords in England. But the big questions related to the role and respective powers of those 2 houses and how they were to be elected. And there were 2, in this Legislative Council debates, there were 2 dominant strands. One strand comprised radical Democrats who were pushing for chartist principles such as secret ballot, payment of members of parliament, and universal manhood suffrage, which meant giving the vote to every man aged 21 and above for both houses. In their view, the role of the Legislative Council should be to review legislation and provide advice, but not reject the legislation of a popularly elected government in the lower house. But a second strand comprised wealthy pastoralists and businessmen who were particularly worried about universal manhood suffrage. They were concerned that it would allow the uneducated masses to make decisions that would be detrimental to property and commercial interests, and they wanted a guarantee that that wouldn't happen. The Legislative Council was their guarantee. In the deal that was struck and built into the 1856 Constitution, the Progressives and the Radical Democrats won universal manhood suffrage in the 36-member lower house, but they had to accept two important matters related to the composition and powers of the Legislative Council. First, voting for an 18-member Legislative Council was to be on the basis of a restricted franchise. It was to be limited to those who met certain property qualifications. In this way, it was argued, the upper house would comprise the wealthy sector of society who would ensure that the interests of that sector were protected. So the property qualifications were these, that to get a vote, to be eligible to vote in the upper house, you had to have a freehold property of £50 or more. You had to have an annual leasehold of £20 or more, or a rental of an annual value of £25 per year or more. Now, in the subsequent debates, often the first two were also included in the debates, but for ease of kind of understanding, I'm going to focus on that third one, the rental value of £25 per year. So that was the first thing. They made sure that the people that were going to fill the Legislative Council were going to be voting the right way and want the right things. But of course they could do that if the Legislative Council didn't have the power to knock back what the House of Assembly, all these uneducated people in the House of Assembly, wanted to do. So the second important thing was both chambers were given equal constitutional powers, apart from money bills having to originate in the lower house. So in Section 1 of the 1856 Constitution says that, it says the same powers as our Legislative Council now has, in 1856. But the problem was that the Constitution didn't describe what happened when there were disagreements between the houses, which might result in a deadlock. So, from the start of responsible government in 1857, it became apparent that the council could amend all bills except money bills, but if the amendments weren't accepted by the lower house, then the bill would lapse. In the case of money bills, it was agreed by an 1857 compact that the Legislative Council could not make amendments, only suggestions, which could be discussed at an informal conference between representatives of both houses. But if the two chambers could not come to an agreement, then the Legislative Council could either accept or reject the bill. In other words, in all cases, the Legislative Council effectively had a power of veto, and there was no process to resolve deadlocks. So, right from the start, the Legislative Council, they moved into Old Parliament House, the Legislative Council, the House of Assembly. The upper house logically met downstairs, and the lower house logically met upstairs. Right from the start, the Legislative Council worked exactly as they'd planned it. The overwhelming majority of members elected to the Legislative Council were wealthy landowners and businessmen, and they fought tooth and nail to protect the status quo. And the Legislative Council frustrated the agenda of successive governments by rejecting all bills deemed inimical to the interests of what was called the producing class, that is, those who owned property and paid the bulk of the taxes, and therefore, it was claimed, had more of a long-term stake in the colony. Not surprisingly, many in the House of Assembly grew increasingly angry about its power relatively to the Legislative Council. The matter was constantly raised in Parliament and in the community in the first 30 years after responsible government began in South Australia in 1857. At first, the primary focus was not on property qualifications, but on ways to make the Legislative Council more open to community opinion, or to lessen the impact of its veto power. However, every attempt was fiercely resisted by the Legislative Council, of course. Prior to the period we're looking at tonight, only 2 changes had been made to the constitutional arrangements, both in 1881, and neither of which really had any effect. But I'll need to quickly describe those 2 changes because I'll refer to them a bit later. The first was there was an attempt to bring the Legislative councillors closer to the people and therefore make them more accountable by increasing the number of councillors from 18 to 24 and creating 4 council electoral districts. So instead of the whole state electing the Legislative Council, as it did until 1881, and of course as it does now, they divided into 4 electorates. And they made the term of a Legislative Council 9 years instead of 10. Now, the Legislative Council in the end went along with that, largely because the 4 new districts they made sure were weighted in favour of rural property. And so none of that really changed the makeup or outlook of the Legislative Council. So second, and this is an important one, there was a plan to deal with those deadlocks, was hammered out. And again, the Legislative Council had the last say. After a lengthy debate, it was agreed that if a bill was passed by the Assembly and rejected by the Council, and in the next Parliament, the same bill passed with an absolute majority in the Assembly and was rejected by the Council again, and if there had been an election in between that happening, then the Governor might choose to call a double dissolution, an election for both houses, or issue writs for the election of 1 or 2 new members of each of those 4 council districts. Now, this deadlock provision has never been used, not least because when it could have been activated, its members, the members of the House of Assembly got cold feet about the cost of another election so close to the previous, and knowing that it mightn't resolve the matter anyway. So that's that deadlock provision that I'll refer to later. By this time, by the time Parliament had been extended by half a house in 1889, do you remember last year we talked about they ran out of money, so they only built half a house, and the House of Assembly moved from upstairs in the old Parliament House across to the new Parliament House, half a house, and the Legislative Council moved upstairs. So by the time that had happened in 1889, the focus turned to ways to change the composition of the Legislative Council by expanding who could vote for the council. So that became the focus. Let's see if we can change who can vote for. By then, property qualifications meant that 5/7 of those who could vote in the House of Assembly elections, okay, about 72%, were denied the right to vote in Legislative Council elections. This, it was argued, was an affront to democracy since it denied the principle of political equality. Indeed, this principle became even starker after women won the vote in 1894 because only 1 person per eligible property was granted the vote for the Legislative Council. And since property was usually in the name of the male, it was overwhelmingly the men who could vote. So you have to think about that. You could all vote, men and women vote in the House of Assembly elections, but then nearly 3/4 of you could not vote for the Legislative Council, and it was the Legislative Council that was determining which legislation was to get through. This situation incensed Liberal Democrats, and you'd be surprised to know that the person at most incensed was Charles Kingston, who we talked about last year. And the Kingston government, which went from 1893 to 1899, there were no less than 9 attempts to broaden the franchise, which included the following strategies. He had, it's not in this order, but these sorts of things. There was a couple of bills to reduce property qualifications from £25 to £15, which they knew would immediately give another 7, 8, 10,000 people the vote for Legislative Council. That was knocked back. There were a couple of efforts to introduce household suffrage. That meant any person in occupation or tenant of any house or part of a house occupied as a separate dwelling could vote, but it's only the person that had the property in their name. So, but in some versions, both the husband and wife could vote, and this was referred to as the dual vote. So when you hear me refer to the dual vote, it was, yes, this should apply to both husband and wife. So household suffrage, which it didn't get through, it didn't get off the ground. But if you got it off the ground, it meant that people living in hotels or itinerants or whatever still wouldn't have the vote. The third thing they tried was various combinations of those first two. So it was, for an example, reduce the rental from £25 to 15 and introduce the dual vote. That was one attempt that he made. That was knocked back. And the final one, which was just, kicking against the wind, I mean, there was no chance of this getting through, which was introduce adult suffrage so that everyone who could vote in the House of Assembly could vote in the Legislative Council. Now, given that the Legislative Council held all the cards in terms of accepting or rejecting proposals for reform, it'll come as no surprise that none of these proposals was successful. So by 1900, the quest to reform the franchise had become the central political issue. Now, just a little bit of background to political parties, and then we'll get on to the three acts. For the first 30 years, since responsible government in 1857, as those who've been in the lectures before know, there were no political parties with external party organisations and agreed party platforms. Only independents who gathered together in transient factions to form governments, and this resulted in great political instability, with the average length of time of a government being about 12 months. However, the emergence of and we did this last year, the United Labour Party in 1891 changed all of that. Its emergence prompted many Conservatives to band together under the banner of the National Defence League and caused progressive Liberals to coalesce more tightly than had been the case in the previous 40 years. So as we saw last year, this resulted in a greater stability of government. The Kingston Liberals governed from 1893 to 1899, which made Charles Kingston the longest continuously serving Premier of 19th century South Australia. After the fall of the Kingston government in late 1899, by the way, the franchise Legislative Council, and the week-long ministry of Solomon, Frederick Holder became Premier, leading a group of Kingston Liberals. And then when Holder was elected to the Federal Parliament in May 1901, John Jenkins, who'd been Chief Secretary in the Holder government, was commissioned to take his place as Premier. So when the South Australian Parliament met for the first time after Federation in July 1901, there were at least three identifiable groupings in the South Australian Parliament, and I'll introduce these and the key characters for Act 1. So first of all, in the middle, the government, led by Jenkins, who was Premier, and two leading figures, Richard Butler and Archibald Peake. So they were a large group of independents, okay, but they were Kingstonian Liberals, and Kingston had been able to hold this group together. They represented they weren't a political party, they represented progressive liberalism with a focus on social and electoral reform and a leaning to industrial reforms and protectionism. They wanted gradual extensions to the franchise. The Liberals were led by John Jenkins, the first and only South Australian Premier to have been born in the United States, in Pennsylvania. Jenkins had come to South Australia in 1878 on a business trip with a publishing company at the age of 27, and ended up staying and establishing business enterprises in Adelaide. He was a fine debater, an eloquent speaker in his distinctive American accent. He entered the South Australian Parliament in 1887 as one of the members for Sturt. At that time he was Mayor of Unley, and then Torrens, and he held a number of ministerial portfolios in the Kingston and Holder administrations in the 1890s. There are two other members of the Jenkins Liberals who play key roles in this story. The first is the Treasurer in the Jenkins government, Richard Butler, otherwise known as Dismal Dick, who was so named because of his gloomy speaking style, dour manner and penchant for cutting expenditure. Butler, who came from a farming background, was a member for Barossa and had been the Minister for Agriculture and for Education in the Kingston government. He actually had 11 children, and one of them became Premier in the 1920s and 1930s, Richard Leighton Butler, and he's the great-great-grandfather of Mark Butler, our Federal Minister for Health. The other was Archibald Peake, who in 1901 was in the early years of his time in Parliament. He grew up in the southeast and was the District Clerk of the District Council of Narracourt for nearly 20 years before entering the House of Assembly in 1897 as a member for Albert, then Victoria and Albert. He supplemented his parliamentary income as a partner in the Mount Barker auctioneering firm of Monks and Peake, and his small farmer radicalism meant that he supported the Kingston and Holder governments, and Peake, the town in the Mallee, is named after Archibald Peake. Okay, the second group, the Australian National League, it's a Conservative party which had originally formed in South Australia as the National Defence League, but which around this time became known as the Australian National League, the ANL, and was fiercely anti-socialist. They advocated support for private enterprise and minimal government interference in the economy, preservation of existing constitutional arrangements and strong ties to the British Empire. They strongly opposed any change to property qualifications for the franchise. The Conservative ANL leader was John Darling Jr., who was a Scottish-born South Australian businessman who entered Parliament in 1896 as the member for East Torrens and then Torrens, and immediately joined the Conservative Australian National League. Now, Darling actually followed his father's career, in becoming a partner in John Darling and Son Grain Shipping Company with an interest in a number of mills. And that's Darling Senior in the middle, John Darling Jr. On our right, facing it. And I notice, Your Excellency, that Governor LaHunt hadn't had the scavenger boys in that day, if you just have a look behind. But they managed to miss it, I see. He then became a politician. Darling became known as the Wheat King of Australia and was later chairman of BHP. He had a passion for freedom of contract and despised trade unionism and the Labor Party. One of his 6 brothers was Joe Darling, who was captain of the Australian cricket team at the time. And then the third group, the United Labor Party, which had a strong focus on workers' rights and industrial reform, welfare measures to reduce inequality and poverty, and constitutional and electoral reforms. Now, they wanted to abolish the Legislative Council, but failing that, adult suffrage they were advocating. The Labor leader was Tom Price, who was born in Wales and grew up in Liverpool in somewhat impoverished circumstances. Tom Price became a stonemason like his father, but moved to South Australia with his wife Anne in 1883 after he developed silicosis from stone cutting. He found work in his trade, and he was one of those who cut the stone and shaped the marble columns for the new South Australian Parliament House. Tom was a dedicated Wesleyan Methodist and teetotaler. He threw himself into the union movement and in 1893 became one of the first members to represent the United Labor Party in the House of Assembly when he was elected as a member for Sturt and later Torrens. He was an autodidact who was known for his honesty and directness and seen to be a passionate and fluid orator, albeit heated debate often caused him to bleed from the lungs because of the silicosis. During his time in Parliament, Tom Price often wrote articles about South Australian politics in the Labor Party paper, The Herald, usually under a pseudonym, where he frequently attacked the Legislative Council, for which he had a range of names, including the House of Horrors, the House of Landlords, the House of Privilege, and the House of Misrepresentation. And Price and John Darling did not get along. In 1902, in the Labor Party's paper, The Herald, and I just picked this one piece out, under the heading Parliamentary Palaverer, Price described Darling as an ardent worshipper of the golden calf. His cold form, so reminiscent of a chilled carcass, is incapable of being warmed by a generous feeling toward the unfittest. The perpetual sneer which mars his countenance can never be transformed into a seraphic smile. He is only clever in comparison with the dull mediocrities comprising his party. Anyway, Price, those of you that know Price Memorial Oval in Hawthorn, home of Australia's bowling club of the year, the Hawthorn Bowling Club, and also home of Sturt District Cricket Club and the Mitcham Football Club. And if you go into Brown Hill Creek, just at the beginning there now, there's a cairn which has got a plaque to Tom Price. So, the story of the political parties in the first decade of the 20th century is a story of the fluidity of these different parties and groupings. independents in the middle, two parties on either side, and until they settled down into a two-party system. So, Act 1. Between 1901 and 1905, the Jenkins government had to navigate difficult economic circumstances. There was a drought which adversely affected wheat production, business was struggling, living costs were going up and unemployment was rising. An environment where the government was looking to cut costs while dealing with the social consequences was always going to test political allegiances and alignments. As a Kingston Liberal, John Jenkins was seen to have progressive views, and so the ULP, the Labor Party, which had supported, although never been in coalition with Kingston in the 1890s, had developed pretty cordial relations with him. But early on it became pretty clear that Jenkins was more interested in keeping John Darling, the leader of the Conservative opposition, on side than in pursuing policies that were consistent with the Kingstonian tradition. So almost from the start of his time as Premier in 1901, the Labor Party began to oppose Jenkins. And it wasn't long before some Liberals also began to feel uncomfortable about the direction Jenkins was taking them. Now, there are a number of issues that brought to the surface the ideological differences that existed within the Kingston Liberals and between some of their group and the Labor Party. The policy to move from horse-drawn trams to electric trams was one of these. The Conservative ANL was strongly in favour of a privatised system, while the Labor Party and many Kingstonian Liberals, including Jenkins, had been adamant that public transport needed to be in public hands. The matter was brought to a head when a businessman, Francis H. Snow, acting on behalf of a couple of large London-based companies, proposed a plan to acquire and merge the major horse tramway companies into a new privately owned electric tramway company, which would have 21 years of exclusive operating rights. The question of public ownership versus privatisation raised the political heat. There were public meetings, deputations to ministers, petitions and advertisements arguing the case one way or another. But the key point is that when a member of the Conservative ANL introduced a private members bill in 1901 to facilitate the Snow scheme, Jenkins changed his earlier stance on the issue and supported the bill. Dubbed the Snow tramway grab by the Labor Party, it was described by its paper, The Herald, as being a robbery of the people's rights, as a few wealthy people enriched themselves. So that was one thing that put them offside with Jenkins. Another issue that demonstrated the ideological divide between the political groupings was franchise reform. As he cosied up to the ANL, it was clear that Jenkins was backing off his long-held policy ambition to expand the franchise for the upper house by introducing household suffrage. On this issue, Price kept up the attack through speeches and motions of no confidence in the Jenkins government, accusing Jenkins of running a spineless government which was indifferent to franchise reform. If he was not going to introduce household suffrage, then at the very least, said Price, Jenkins should start to enlarge the franchise by dropping the annual rental from £25 to £15. By the time of the May 1902 elections, it was clear that Jenkins was more interested in keeping the Conservatives on side than in adhering to his previously stated Liberal positions, earning him the nickname of the political acrobat, who Price described as being blessed with a swivel neck which enables him to bow to both sides of the street at once. But Labor was not on its own. There was a small number of progressive Liberals, led by Archibald Peake, who were also disenchanted with their erstwhile colleague Jenkins, especially his lack of action on franchise reform, and they were starting to flirt with the Labor Party. Indeed, when the election arrived, Peake's group decided to campaign as a separate entity, calling themselves Independent Liberals. The Kingstonian Independent Liberals had split, with the Independent Liberals flirting with the Labor Party, Jenkins' Conservative Liberals actually surviving in government because of the Conservative ANL. So this meant there were now 4 identifiable political groupings, 2 political parties, the ULP and the ANL, and 2 parliamentary groupings, the Jenkins Conservative Liberals and Peake's Independent Liberals. The election campaign brought out all the developing policy differences in stark relief. The ANL focused on the Labor Party, accusing it of being socialistic, state monopolistic and paralysing to private enterprise, and with an ambition to abolish the Legislative Council, whilst the Labor Party zeroed in on Jenkins even more than Darling, saying, and here's one quote, that the false friend is always more hated than the open enemy, and Jenkins Iscariot accumulates unpopularity fast. The small group of Peake-led Liberals also focused on former colleague Jenkins and his backtracking on household suffrage for the Legislative Council, and outlined policies consistent with their previous Kingstonian positions. Jenkins, on the other hand, preached pragmatism in dire economic times, putting up arguments about the need to cut back on government expenditure, policies which were more like the official opposition, the ANL. And the outcome of the 1902 election was that the ANL won the largest number of seats, but no political party or grouping held a majority of seats, and so clearly deals would have to be done. Jenkins approached Darling seeking his support to stay in government, and amazingly, despite having more seats than the Jenkins Liberals, Darling agreed, and it was Jenkins who was sworn in as Premier, with his government receiving the support of the official opposition. When asked why, John Darling replies, well, as the policy of the government had been mainly taken from the opposition, the duty of the opposition was to support the ministry. So Jenkins, the political acrobat, had completed his ideological backflip and was now firmly in the Conservative camp, with John Darling pulling the strings. It was described by Quiz as government by opposition, referring to Premier Darling as directing Jenkins and his crowd of knock-kneed political puppets who cling like boneless barnacles to offices which have long since become the perquisites of the nominal opposition. In the next 3 years, the Jarling-Denkins government, as many described it, slowly jettisoned the policy positions Jenkins had espoused as a Kingstonian Liberal. Taking the two examples referred to earlier, the promised replacement of the old horse-drawn tram system with electric trams had become a running political sore. The businessman Snow had trouble raising the funds, the different horse-drawn tram companies were resisting being bought out, and there was a smell of some financial misconduct. And yet Jenkins refused to contemplate his previously held commitment to a public transport service. And in relation to franchise reform, John Jenkins had gone to the 1902 election with the pledge that in the next parliament he would legislate for household suffrage. However, given that wasn't the policy of the opposition, he did nothing about it. Eventually, Peake and his Liberal group became so frustrated that in late 1904, Peake introduced a private members' bill to reduce the franchise from £25 per annum to £15 per annum and introduced the dual vote. It was a long way from their coalition partner, the Labor Party's policy, but they thought it was better than nothing. But Peake couldn't get the absolute majority needed for constitutional change, and the bill lapsed in the House of Assembly. Tellingly, Jenkins himself voted with the ANL. While all of this was happening, the political landscape continued to change. In mid-1904, 2 government ministers resigned, and in their place, Jenkins appointed 2 ANL members. So finally, the pretence that Darling's ANL was the official opposition was dropped when it became clear that the government had formed a coalition with the opposition. I think, darling, the fact of our marriage is no longer secret. At about the same time, Jenkins was leaking members from his government group. Some moved across to Peake's Liberals, who in July 1904 formed themselves into a parliamentary grouping now labelled the Liberal Party of the House of Assembly, and became the official opposition because they had the largest of any of the groups then. Some of the remaining Jenkins Liberals aligned with a new political party called the Farmers and Producers Political Union, the FPPU, a conservative rural organisation which becomes what you could call the country wing of the ANL. And Jenkins' treasurer, Dismal Dick Butler, became its parliamentary leader. With all of this movement, Jenkins' political support base was unravelling, and it was clear that he was dreaming about other futures, like going to London as the Agent General or being knighted. And in March 1905, Jenkins resigned as Premier when he was tested by a no confidence motion moved by Tom Price in August 1904. he hung on to power by just one vote with the support of the ANL and the FPPU. So finally, in the tradition of SA premiers to that date, in March 1905, Jenkins resigned as Premier after appointing himself as South Australia's Agent General in London. He advised Governor LaHunt to commission Dismal Dick Butler as Premier. And the departure of Jenkins really ended the Jenkins Conservative political group, which had now been soaked up by parties to the left and the right of it. So that's what you're looking like now. So the government now is Conservative ANL and the FPPU, the opposition, Peake's Liberals, and flirting with the Labor Party. Butler's government limped to the 1905 election, harried by Peake and Price, who were working together to form what Peake described as a genuine opposition rather than a bogus one. So Act 1 closes with South Australia being on the cusp of an historic political change. On the eve of the 1905 election, to be held on Saturday, 27th of May, Tom Price and Archibald Peake made a secret deal. They agreed that if their two groupings combined won a majority in Parliament, they would form a coalition and govern. And whichever of the two parties had the most seats would be entitled to nominate the Premier. It was a hard-fought election, and there were issues such as progressive land tax, the Murray River, electric trams, and what's to be done with the Northern Territory on the table. But a central issue was the franchise, where there were a number of policy positions on offer, and you had the ANL and the FPPU opposing any extension of the franchise, the Liberals wanting £25 to £15 rental, the Labor Party wanting to abolish the Legislative Council, but if you couldn't get that, to go for adult suffrage. Now, I've chosen the 5-member seat of Torrens because I think it offers a good sight into what happened and how things panned out. It was the only seat where two political parties, the ANL and the ULP, ran a full ticket. So remember that they had multi-member electorates then. So this was Torrens with 5 members. So the ANL, they had those 5. 3 of them were mayors. They were very wealthy individuals. The Labor Party had the 5, which is second group down, Connie Beardankle, Price, Smeaton and Vaughan. Campaigning was energetic, and there were many accusations about Labor being unreconstructed socialists and the League serving the interests of the wealthy. Amazingly, Labor won all 5 seats, with the Conservative ANL leader, John Darling, being one of those in the League who lost his seat. And the Herald tells the story that John Darling, at the declaration of the poll, refused to shake Tom Price's hand, simply turning his back on him. But that was the Herald. I don't know whether you could vouch for that or not. The result in Torrens was consistent with the pattern across the state. Overall, Labor trebled its number of seats to 15, with all but one of the 12 seats in the city, while Peake's Liberals won 7 seats. The ANL dropped from 17 seats to 11 in the House of Assembly, and the FPPU won 9. So together, the Labor Party and Peake's Liberals had a small majority, 22 to 20, and given the agreement that the Premier would be drawn from the party or grouping with the largest number of members, Tom Price made history as the first Labor Premier of South Australia, albeit of a minority Labor government. Next day, Price and Peake announced the new 4-person ministry, which included themselves and, well, there they are, Tom Price and Andrew Kirkpatrick, the Labor Party member in the front, and at the back on the right-hand side is Peake and the Liberal O'Loughlin. Dismal Dick Butler became the new leader of the opposition. Would the Labor-Liberal alliance work? Peake argued that the aims and principles of both parties had a great deal in common, with the major difference between them being a difference of degree and speed. And although Price and Peake liked and respected each other, some in the Labor Party were worried that Peake's Liberals were too middle of the road. For their part, the Conservatives accused Peake's breakaway group of being turncoats, simply hungry for power at the expense of principle. In the first couple of years of the coalition, Labor made some policy gains, including dropping Jenkins' attempt to privatise the tramway system via the now failed Snow Tramways scheme, and instead negotiating a scheme to buy out the private horse-drawn tram operators and establish a publicly owned Municipal Tramways Trust, the MTT, to run a new electric tram system. And Price managed to persuade the Liberals to support some progressive legislation on land tax, industrial and social reforms, and free state school secondary education. But the problem was that after being accepted by the lower house, many of these measures were knocked back or mutilated by the Legislative Council. The fact that the League had the ANL had a big majority in the Legislative Council meant that they had complete control of that chamber and therefore the state. So it makes the question of the franchise the political issue of this parliament. The Labor-Liberal alliance had gone to the 1905 election determined to do something about franchise reform. As we said, each party had a different platform on the issue, but Price knew that he didn't have the numbers to get the ULP policy of adult suffrage up, leave alone its policy of abolishing the Legislative Council. So he accepted Peake's £15 rental and dual vote proposal. There were a number of Labor Party people who weren't very happy with that compromise, but Price was held in very high regard and there was no insurrection. In August 1905, a bill seeking to reduce the franchise to £15 and introduce the dual vote was introduced into the House of Assembly, with the usual arguments being run. For example, the reformers quoted the stat that the property franchise excluded 5/7 of the adult population from voting, whilst those opposed to franchise reform repeated the mantra, but that it was but a first step towards the abolition of the Legislative Council and that property qualifications were needed to protect the wealth producers of the community. At the same time, the government introduced a second bill designed to increase the number of ministers to 5 and to loosen the deadlock provision. After the two bills passed the lower house, they went on to the Legislative Council, where they came under heavy fire. They were seen as being designed to attack the powers of the upper house on two flanks. A quote from Sir John Downer's speech captures the mood, and Downer, who'd been Premier, we saw last year, had gone to the federal parliament, was now back in the Legislative Council. And Downer said, the franchise, it's just an example of the sort of what they were saying, is not a question in itself, but only a means to an end, which is compulsory repurchase of land, punitive taxation, breach of national faith. The object of the present movement is a bestowal of a vote with the declared intention of first reducing the council, then its emasculation, and ultimately its destruction. The Legislative Council voted to combine the two bills and then mutilate all its key features with many amendments which effectively rejected the £15 franchise, the dual vote and the changed deadlock provision. It was returned to the Assembly, which was so incensed that the upper house had combined the two bills that it refused to discuss the amendments and just sent them back with a request that they be reconsidered. In turn, the Legislative Council railed against the contemptuous nature of the Assembly's reply and battered it back until finally the House of Assembly reviewed the amendments and then rejected them. And all was back to square one. Price and Peake considered their next move. At the beginning of the new session of Parliament in July 1906, they reintroduced the bill that was lost in the last session and placed it at the top of the notice paper. Tom Price once again laid out the argument for change. It cannot be said that the people of South Australia govern themselves when the repeated attempts of the House of Assembly to give expression to their will are frustrated by a chamber whose authority is so reduced that it only represents 2/7 of the population which elects this House. By this time, he'd made it clear that if the bill was again mutilated by the Legislative Council, he would ask for a dissolution. He'd ask the governor to have an election to obtain the unequivocal views of the people and set in train that 1881 deadlock provision. Remember, knock back a bill with an election in between. So the stakes were now very high for all parties and groups. In October, Archibald Peake's parliamentary-based group of 9 Liberals prepared themselves to the battle by forming themselves into a new party, no longer now just a parliamentary group, but now a new party. the Liberal Democratic Union, which, like the Labor Party and the League, had an external party organisation. So now, what had once been a cohesive group of Liberal independents under Kingston, and when Jenkins started as Premier, had disappeared, with some moving to the Conservatives and some moving to the Liberal Democratic Union. So there were now 4 political parties: the Conservatives, the ANL and the FPPU, and the Labor Party and the Liberal Democratic Union in coalition. At this stage, the pressure was starting to take its toll on Tom Price. Still just 54, his stonecutter-related lung disease was starting to worsen, and after a long speech, he was not only tired, but often coughed up a little blood. The reintroduced franchise bill sailed through the Assembly and was off again to the Legislative Council, which appeared to be completely unfazed by the threat of an election. Instead, the same old arguments were trotted out, with Conservative stalwarts like George Riddick warning that the Legislative Council is the only safeguard against a state of anarchy, and George Brookman dismissing the dual vote on the grounds that it would simply duplicate votes, because the wife would vote the same way as her husband. But just like last time, the Council rejected the key features of the bill and returned it to the House, which in turn refused to accept the changes. A conference of representatives of both houses was staged, but no agreement could be reached. Bemoaning the grave crisis, Tom Price decided to act. He visited Governor LaHunt and requested a dissolution of the House. He said to the Governor, I want an election. The Governor refused, saying, we just had an election last year. And Tom Price tendered his resignation and that of his ministry. For the next Governor LaHunt then asked Richard Butler to form a government. And for the next 24 hours, there was frantic politicking as the Conservatives on the right-hand side were trying to induce the Liberal Democratic Union to come across to them, saying this will isolate the Labor Party for all time if we do this. But Peake and his Liberals held firm, and Butler couldn't get the numbers. So Governor LaHunt then asked Price to carry on his administration, to which Price said, well, I'll do that as long as you call an election. So the Governor had no option, and he dissolved the 18th Parliament, making it the shortest in the state's history, July the 20th, 1905 to October the 10th, 1906. The election was set for Saturday, November the 3rd, 1906, so to be a short 3-week campaign with almost the sole issue being the franchise. The whole state is talking about it, so let's go to the main event. Tom Price and Archibald Peake know that if they are to succeed, their collaboration can't only be in Parliament, it must extend to the hustings. And it's agreed that the Labor Party and the Liberal Democratic Union won't stand candidates against each other, and Price and Peake campaign as a ministerial alliance. They speak as one voice on the need to reduce the franchise to £15 and the dual vote. Now, the Labor Party campaign is launched at the Exhibition Building on North Terrace. That beautiful building was erected in 1887 for Queen Victoria's Jubilee, was used for a variety of public purposes between then and 1963, when it was demolished for the beautiful Napier building at the University of Adelaide. It was one of the saddest demolitions I think we have in our history. But then that's where they met, and there was this was on the October the 15th, 1906, and there was a record crowd of nearly 8,000 people, the majority of whom are passionate supporters of franchise reform, and the atmosphere is electric. The main event is Tom Price. But to warm up the crowd, Tom has asked his Labor colleague and friend, Tom Smeaton, and subsequent Price biographer, who he calls the poet, to write and lead some patriotic franchise songs to be sung to famous tunes. The song sheets have been distributed around the hall, and you can see them in some of the old papers, but one of them was to the tune of John Brown's Body, and that chorus, glory, glory to the franchise, glory, glory to the franchise. But the last song was one that was well known in South Australia. It was based on the Song of Australia, which had won a South Australian competition to create a patriotic song sponsored by the Gawler Institute back in 1859. And I want you to imagine that 8,000 people, so let's say 25, 30 times this group, in that wonderful exhibition hall, singing the Song of Australia, but really singing about the franchise. And I'm going to invite you to do that. You up for it? Is a land beneath whose skies the voices of the people rise, pleading for the full franchise, the full franchise. The cry is heard from morn till night, from valley, plain and mountain height, shed on us freedom's bounteous light. The franchise, the franchise, the franchise. Thank you. I didn't know whether... but as the last notes fade, the great man walks onto the stage. And he starts slowly. I feel tonight altogether overcome by the greatness of this meeting and also by your reception. There's cheers and a voice. You're worth it, Tom. I ask you, why are we assembled here? Loud voices. For the franchise. I want to say we're fighting a council elected upon a privileged vote by a privileged class, and their votes and influence are cast in the interest of a class. The Legislative Council has waited long and resisted, and when it's passed legislation, it's been in such a mutilated condition that it's been of no consequence or good to us. The Legislative Council will not trust the people. And Price goes on for an hour and a half, setting out the arguments for extending the franchise, until exhausted, he comes to his peroration. Every elector who loves his family, his home, his country and progress and social redemption, I call upon to vote. A weapon that comes down as still as snowflakes fall upon the sod, but executes a free man's will as lightning does the will of God, and from its force nor doors nor locks can shield you. 'Tis the ballot box. The ballot box will be filled by your votes so that the embargo in the way of liberty and progress should be removed. I feel too exhausted to go on any longer. I ask you to rally up on November the 3rd. I thank you for the great and glorious hearing you've given me and hope my appeal will not be made in vain to the people of South Australia. As he sits down, the entire crowd rises and gives 3 ringing cheers, followed by "He's a jolly good fellow." But the effort had really taken out of him. For some days following that huge meeting, Price is in the hands of a doctor, and others have to carry on the election fight. For the next 2 weeks, the parties trade blows through advertising and public events, with the ANL warning that tampering with the franchise is simply the first step towards abolishing the council, and the Labor Party pleading for voters to recognise that the franchise is the central issue. Don't be put off by red herrings. On election night, as the results come in, it's clear that the coalition has won a great victory. Hundreds gather outside the Advertiser and register to see that the Labor Party has retained all its seats and won 4 more for a total of 19, including all metropolitan seats. Second in, Torrens, they've won their 5 Torrens seats again. Only 3 of the Conservatives, ANL, stood in that one. While the Liberal Democratic Union retained its 9 country seats and wins a 10th. The Conservative ANL and FPPU, on the other hand, have gone backwards and can only muster 13 seats. The coalition has won a stunning victory, and given that the election was focused on one topic, many are reading it as a referendum on the franchise issue, with a majority of over 50,000 in favour of franchise reform. The Advertiser did a franchise reform gauge. Has the stronghold of the Legislative Council been stormed at last, as Labor's newspaper, The Herald, had portended on election day? When Parliament resumed on November the 30th, 1906, it was the first time that every member of the House of Assembly had been a member of a political party. However, although the Labor-Liberal coalition had a commanding majority, 29 votes to 13 in the Assembly, and a clear electoral mandate for franchise reform, the Conservative ANL still dominated the Legislative Council. On the first sitting day of the session, Premier Price introduced the same franchise extension bill, £15 and dual vote, pointing out that now the people had spoken, the time had come for the Legislative Council to shift their position on the franchise. If they don't set price, he'd trigger the deadlock provision and ask the governor for a double dissolution, both houses going to the people. Very quickly, the bill was carried in its entirety in the House of Assembly. Up it went to the Legislative Council. Would they now heed the voice of the people? It didn't take long to find out. Far from taking the election result as a mandate, the bill was again subjected to the same unacceptable amendments by the Council, which once again were rejected by the Assembly. Nothing had been resolved, except that Price entered 1907 with the threat of a double dissolution up his sleeve. And yet the issue went quiet in the first half of that year. Clearly, Price was dealing with a complex dilemma. On the one hand, he was under pressure from many in the Labor Party who wanted him to go all the way and ask the governor for a double dissolution, as the never-used deadlock provision allowed. On the other hand, Price was aware that, apart from the costs involved, the election outcome might not resolve the issue anyway. For their part, Price's coalition partners, the LDU, were getting cold feet about fighting another election, and they were being wooed by the ANL about some possible compromise in relation to the franchise rental amount. Price didn't want to jeopardise the relationship he had with the coalition, and he was also aware of a mood in the community wanting a break from the issue of franchise reform. So after considering all those factors, eventually Price decided to give the council one more chance and introduce the old bill in the new session. The second and third readings of the bill were agreed to without division in the Assembly, and off it went once more. At first it was déjà vu, but it became apparent that the Conservative legislative councillors were worried about community backlash if they continued to give nothing, and there was talk of compromise in the air. So you imagine all the sort of different groups in Parliament's House talking about what was possible. And when the Conference of Representatives of both houses was held to discuss the amendments, the ANL came up with an offer. They finally came up with an offer. They said they'd reduce the rental cap from £25 to £17. We won't go to 15, 25 to 17. But because we're doing that, you've got to drop the dual vote. No dual vote. We can't have the partner of the property owner voting as well. But in addition, what we'll give you is the votes, the following worthies can vote. Minister's religion, head of a college or a school who resides in a college or school premises. So these were people they thought would be safe enough to entrust the vote with. The compromise proposal was, of course, closer to the Liberal Democratic Union policy position, but in the end, Price agreed to it, making it the first change in property qualifications for franchise since responsible government began in South Australia in 1857. Premier Price tried to put a brave face on it, describing it as an instalment of the great reform they were looking for, and pointing out that it gave at least 10,000 more people the vote. He argued that if it had been rejected, there would have been another 3 years of struggle with no prospect of getting anything better than was already achieved. Others, of course, weren't quite so sanguine. In the Labor Party, they said that he should have gone to the double dissolution and fought to the death. And those who opposed franchise reform said, see, you didn't get much at all, despite all your grand words at that big exhibition hall meeting. So for the next 18 months, franchise reform took more of a back seat as the coalition focused on other policy matters. But its legislation was still being frequently rejected or changed beyond recognition by the Legislative Council. And so franchise reform didn't completely disappear. John Verran, who you'll hear more about in a minute, introduced a bill for adult franchise. But even the Liberal Democratic Union didn't support it, and so that didn't even get through the House of Assembly. By this time, the strain of the franchise battle had exacerbated Price's illness, and he was increasingly confined to bed and absent from parliamentary duties. On March the 9th, 1909, for example, the Municipal Tramways Trust inaugurated its first electric tram line at Kensington, which was opened by Tom Price's wife, Anne, in his absence. It wasn't long after that, on May the 31st, 1909, when Tom Price died at the age of 57. His death was widely mourned, and his state funeral was one of the largest in South Australian history, with thousands lining the 2-mile route from his Hawthorn cottage to the Mitcham Cemetery. So Act 2 ends with a question hanging in the political air. With Price gone, can the coalition survive? Now, I'm nearly there, by the way. Okay, it's just the third act. For some time before Price had died, tensions had been developing between Labor and the Liberal Democratic Union. Some in the Labor Party felt that the Liberals had diluted its socialist agenda, and there was a strong feeling that Liberal Democratic Union members shouldn't be looked after or have immunity at the next election. At the same time, it seemed that the small gain of £25 to £17 had satisfied the Liberal Democratic Union appetite for franchise reform, and importantly, it removed one of the biggest barriers that they had with the Conservatives on the other side. Indeed, there were reports that Peake had started to flirt with the farmers and producers, which some in the Labor Party were now dubbing the Alarmers and Traducers Party. Price's death exacerbated these tensions. Archibald Peake had assumed the position of acting Premier, and Labor's expectation, of course, was as soon as they elected someone, the leader, to take Price's place, that he would become Premier. When the Labor caucus met in May 1909, it elected John Verran, a member for Wallaroo, as its leader. Now, Verran was a larger-than-life character. Born in Cornwall in 1856, his family emigrated to South Australia when he was still a young child, eventually settling in the Cornish settlement in Moonta. He had very little formal education, receiving most of it via the ministers of the primitive Methodist Church in Moonta, where he later taught Sunday school and frequently gave sermons. Indeed, he credited his religion with him becoming a politician, saying, "I am an MP because I am a PM," he would say. And his political meetings in Moonta sometimes sounded more like revivalist meetings, with cries of hallelujah often greeting his statements. Verran had become a picky boy when he was 10. Now, picky boys, of course, were those very young kids who, and now that's in 1913. Verran was a picky boy back 40 years before that, but it's the only picture I could find, and I think it was still pretty much as it was in Verran's time. And they'd be there on the tables picking out the ore, the valued ore from the dross. They were only 10 or 11. And that they'd follow that career as being a picky boy by going down in the mines. So he was a miner at Moonta for 30 years, president of the Amalgamated Miners Association, and was elected as a member for Wallaroo in 1901. Verran's working-class mining and trade union background, as well as being a Cornish Methodist, made him very popular in the Copper Triangle. In 1910, the Observer described him as being a portly, thick-set Cornishman with decided opinions to which he gives utterance in an earnest, vigorous and rugged style. One well-known comment he directed at an opponent in the Cornish dialects of the northern York Peninsula was, "If your brains was dynamite and they was to explode, 'twouldn't blow your hat off." Immediately after his election as leader of the Labor Party, Verran asked Peake to stand aside as Premier, pointing out that the Liberal Democratic Union only had 9 members compared to 19 of the Labor Party, and Tom Price had wanted him, Verran, to take over as Premier. But Peake, believing that Verran didn't have the experience, refused and instead offered the Labor Party 2 cabinet posts. Labor rejected the offer, and at that point the coalition collapsed. Peake knew that if he was going to stay in power, he needed to confirm the support of the FFPU and the ANL, and the Conservative leader, Richard Butler, and Peake had been in conversation even before Price's death, and now came the chance to enact an agreement. Together they had the numbers, and the new governor, Sir Day Bosanquet, commissioned, now I know this is serious, but I just wanted to point this out. Sir Day Bosanquet, his nephew, was Bernard Bosanquet, who played for Mizzle and invented the googly, the wrong un, or the Bosie. I just thought that was an important point. Anyway, Sir Day Bosanquet was the governor at the time, and he commissioned the new government. And so you had, in the space of 1 month, the coalition government had split asunder, with the Labor half now becoming the official opposition, and the Liberal half now joining forces with the previous opposition to form government. Verran and the ULP were furious, arguing that Peake had abandoned the spirit of the 1905 coalition agreement, as well as his principles, just to hang on to power, and they began planning for the April 1910 election, which was going to have as its focus its adult franchise. In the meantime, Peake governed with the support of the 9 members of the Liberal Democratic Union. They were dubbed the Nimble Nine because for 6 months they governed and 6 of them were ministers. By now you had 6 ministers, had gone up from 4 to 6. But there was 6 months, and as time passed it came clear that the partnership was going beyond just being an informal agreement. At the end of 1909, 3 of these people stepped aside, committed suicide, and Peake welcomed Richard Butler and 2 other members of the ANL and FFPU back into his ministry. So it was now the Peake-Butler ministry, and talks began again about the possibilities for a more permanent partnership. As the new political arrangement took shape, what I thought was interesting is you can see there's a notable change in political discourse. It seemed that the grouping into 2 broad camps had hardened and simplified the ideological differences between them, as both groups constructed the voter choice as being a binary between liberalism versus socialism, or wealth versus ordinary people. A couple of examples. I'll give. Richard Butler says in a letter to his electorate, revolutionary socialism is a distinct menace to the good government of the state, and it rests with the electors to see it makes no headway in South Australia. For his part, John Verran, even as he tried to reject this simple binary, seemed to confirm it. At his campaign speech in Wallaroo, he argued the anti-socialist cry, as it has been called, is not the cry of patriotism, it's the cry of the wealthy classes and their parasites. It's the rich man's shriek of fear, lest the working classes might claim the just meed of wealth, which rightly belonged to them as toilers. Anti-socialism meant power to the rich and drudgery and poverty to the worker. I just thought that hardening of political rhetoric was quite interesting in terms of what was now happening. So the gloves were off for the April 1910 election. Franchise reform lay at the heart of the whole thing, and the result was incredible. It was staggering. The Labor Party won all the metropolitan seats and another 10 in the country, and it now had a majority in the House of Assembly and could govern in its own right, becoming the first majority Labor government in Australia. And it meant that, unlike Tom Price, Verran didn't have to withdraw from caucus to be Premier. The journey from picky boy to miner to local Methodist preacher to trade union leader to Premier was now complete. However, after he formed his ministry, it was all downhill for Jack Verran. There'd been some, in the face of rising prices, falling wages and growing unemployment, there'd been a whole series of strikes across the state. And at first the Verran government did very little, and then, much to the anguish of many in the Labor Party, he got police intervention into the strikes and also allowed scab labour to be employed. And so he was having troubles on that front, and then to compound his problems, in October 1910, Peake's Liberal Democratic Union formally merged with the ANL and the FFPU to form a single political party called the Liberal Union. The fusion, as it was called, meant that the Labor Party now faced a united and well-organised opposition. After a decade of shifting alliances, South Australia had a dominant 2-party system. So, and I'll be pretty quick about this, one of the first things they did, the new government, was to introduce a bill for adult suffrage. Fierce debate in the House of Assembly, but Labor had the numbers there, and it gets through, and predictably it's rejected by the Legislative Council. And the Conservatives then bait Verran, so what are you going to do now? Well, Verran decided to do something incredible, I thought. Instead of trying to democratise the Legislative Council through franchise reform, he thought, I'm going to address its powers to veto legislation head on. And he and his colleagues had been watching what was happening in England, where the Asquith government had managed to strip the House of Lords of their absolute veto by stacking the House of Lords with their appointments. and leaving it with the power, now this is important, the power to delay legislation for up to 1 year, but not block it indefinitely. Verran thought that something similar should happen in South Australia. So in 1911 he introduced the Council Veto Bill, and this bill aimed to resolve deadlocks between the lower and the upper house by allowing certain bills, if passed twice by the Assembly in 2 separate sessions, you know that old one, with a general election intervening, not to go to double dissolution, but to proceed to the Governor for assent without requiring approval from the Legislative Council. So the response from the Liberal Union and the House of Assembly was they just went berserk. Peake calling it a revolutionary, drastic and destructive measure, and there were some really willing exchanges. But there's a lot of cynicism too about the motives for the bill, with some suggesting that knowing it wouldn't succeed, he knows it won't get through the Legislative Council, it's just a red herring by Verran to appease many in the Labor Party who was critical of his actions during the strike. Well, they were correct in the first part of the assumption. The bill was rejected by the Legislative Council, but they were wrong to think that Verran was only using it as a ruse. In November 1911, without informing Parliament, Verran asked Governor Sir Day Bosanquet to send to the British government a request to amend the South Australian Constitution by the passage of an Imperial Act to prevent the Legislative Council from having a veto power. Yes, you heard that right. The South Australian Premier, in the name of democratising the Legislative Council, was asking another Parliament to amend the South Australian Constitution without the knowledge or involvement of the South Australian Parliament. Now, while waiting for a reply, Verran was having another stoush with the Legislative Council, and they held blocked supply. And you've heard a lot about blocking of supply this week. So they blocked supply. So, and there's an interesting story in itself. But so Verran thought on December the 23rd, 1911, I haven't heard from the British government my request. So he sent them a thing saying, now they're blocking supply, can you give me a reply? On December the 26th, day after Christmas, the Secretary of State for the Colonies replied by cablegram that the British government was unable to comply with the government's request because interference of Imperial Parliament in internal affairs of a self-governing state would not be justified until every South Australian constitutional remedy had been exhausted, and then only in response to a request of the overwhelming majority of the people. Still without supply, Verran sought a week's adjournment and pondered his next move. And on January the 3rd, 1912, he stood up to a packed and noisy House and gallery in Parliament and revealed to Parliament for the first time that he'd sought British intervention to resolve the crisis, but that his request had been denied, but that he'd gone to Governor Bosanquet and asked if he could take the people to an election. And the Governor had agreed to that, provided supply was passed. And he finished by saying, so we're going to have an election, and as soon as we're returned, I'm going to introduce the Legislative Veto Bill, the Adult Suffrage Bill and the Appropriation Bill, and if that's rejected again, I'll trigger the deadlock provision, and if that didn't work in the face of the overwhelming majority of the people, then I'll go to the British government and I'll say I've done everything you've asked. And so, just as it happened in 1906 and 1910, the focus of the 1912 election was to be on franchise reform and on the relationship between and relative powers of the Legislative Council and the House of Assembly. In addition, there was debate about Verran's appeal for British intervention. The Liberal Union and a large section of the press described it as an embarrassment to South Australia, which was not the actions of an independent democracy and amounted to nothing more than crying to mother. For its part, the Labor Party argued that Verran had no choice in the face of the undemocratic obstruction by the Legislative Council, and it was an attempt to strengthen South Australian democracy. So the short campaign, described by the Register as about the fiercest that had ever been conducted in South Australia at that time, the two parties were facing off against one another for the first time. And with their hardened political rhetoric, the Labor Party was using the slogan, the people against the Legislative Council, with the charge that the Liberals were looking after the interests of the wealthy, whilst for the Liberals it was the people versus Trades Hall, with the charge that the Labor Party was in the pockets of the unions. And in the end, the Liberal Party won government for the first time as a political party, with 24 seats, while the Labor Party could only manage 16. Archibald Peake became Premier for the second time, and John Verran, leader of the Labor Party opposition for a short time before handing over to Crawford Vaughan. And so the curtain falls on a tumultuous political decade which had seen the Liberal independents split and go in different ideological directions, joining with or forming political parties, an opposition keep a government in power, a coalition break up with one side joining the opposition and the other becoming the opposition, and the eventual formation of a dominant two-party divide with an associated hardening of political rhetoric. Parties had become the major means by which political representation was organised. Of course, within the Labor versus anti-Labor political template that had been established, there are many divisions and fractures in party-based groupings on both sides that are yet to come. And of course, one of the major causes of this political upheaval was the Legislative Council. South Australia entered 1912, 55 years after responsible government, with the majority of the population still disenfranchised from voting in Legislative Council elections and with the Council's power veto intact. It's an issue that will continue to create division and debate within and across political parties in the community until the last quarter of the 20th century. So I hope I've shown in the two case studies of aspects of democracy examined in this lecture, political parties and the franchise, that the features and processes of any democracy are not givens, but evolve and develop through the struggles of people and ideas. Long may that struggle continue. Thanks. Thanks very much. And now for the epilogue.
It's indeed an act to follow. Let me just start by congratulating Alan for the series of these lectures. They are Herculean undertakings, but he's again brought us a stimulating and thoughtful and entertaining address. I've been asked to say a few words and I'll make them few. The starting premise Alan gives us is largely that ours is a healthy democracy, and this is undoubtedly true, but we are seeing some fraying at the edges. And this is more than just normal wear and tear, and points to some more fundamental changes and possible decay. In his 1953 novel, The Go-Betweens, L.P. Hartley famously said, "The past is a foreign country, they do things differently there." In reflecting on Alan's paper tonight, I'm less sure that these famous observations hold entirely true to the circumstances of South Australian history, and particularly as it relates to our own. What tonight's paper demonstrates is that there's a struggle to achieve more than democratic structures and systems. It's in fact our inheritance. Implicit in Alan's lecture is that we are encouraged to take up that similar efforts, not so much to build, but to maintain. As someone who's spent their professional life in law reform and as a public lawyer, the institutions of states and their relationship to the citizenry, especially those vulnerable members of our society, is of keen interest. It is arguably the key areas for legislative and constitutional reform. In his paper, Alan confronts a number of issues: the central struggle between greater suffrage and the forces that opposed it. The subtext is that the maturation of the party system in this state, and indeed the Commonwealth, during that period after Federation. These are really not just of historical interests, they are analogies in our own time. In many ways, Alan, and I don't think it's any accident, is writing the history of now. And if I could take up just 2 points from his paper. Political instability. Alan outlines the rise of the fledgling Labor Party in South Australia and the reaction from the broader non-Labor movement. The story is developed, gives rise to several observations. This is the similar in other jurisdictions. At the Commonwealth level, with the influx of state politicians after 1901, the key division between the Labor Party and the non-Labor parties, unlike in the states, the passing authority of issues like customs and excise and immigration became the debate between Labor and the free traders and the protectionists. That was the defining feature of that debate. The instability of those governments at the time at the Commonwealth level was mirrored that of in the States. If we think of Barton comes to power in 1901, we get Barton, Deakin, Watson, Reid, Deakin, Fisher, Cook, Fisher, Hughes. 1915. 11 governments from 1901 to 1915. The importance of those moderate liberals, which Stuart McIntyre, the great historian, noted, those moderate liberals who stood between the Conservatives and the forces of Labor at Federation and beyond, became pivotal issues and pivotal movers in both state and federal politics. Kingston here in South Australia, Deakin in Victoria, Andrew Inglis Clark in Tasmania, and Bernard Ringrose Wise in New South Wales. And lastly, if I may say, echoing today, the moderate liberals like Kingston and Deakin appear to be a diminishing quota in the non-Labor forces. And the authority of those major parties also appears to be mirroring the decade after self-government, which Alan describes. If I could move just quickly to constitutional stability. The second theme in Alan's forefronts in his tension between the houses and the significant policy issues, especially privatisation of supply and the franchise. Interesting, the escapades of F. Snow and the privatisation of public transport is particularly redolent in our more contemporary experiences here in South Australia. Snow, as many of you would know, was to go on to make legal history when he was charged in 1914 with trading with the enemy and would find himself in front of the High Court. The failure to pass supply in the upper house of South Australia would undoubtedly, as Alan noted, remind many of us of the commemorations of the Whitlam government's dismissal in 1975. The lessons of that event remains to be debated by political and constitutional circles. I guess there were few revelations of the coverage which we have just witnessed. However, I was surprised really by one thing. The fact that Gough didn't make an appearance was probably the only thing I found exciting about that whole event. On more important of the contemporary, I think what Alan has touched on, is that standoff between the two houses and the over significant policy questions. In Alan's example, the franchise, the deadlock provision in the South Australian Government Constitution, today Section 41, is of quixotic fascination, for it actually doesn't guarantee the solution of a deadlock. After an exhaustion of the two options prescribed by Alan, the dissolution of the houses in an election or the appointment of additional members in the Legislative Council, there is no guarantee that the dispute will be resolved. As a constitutional lawyer, it is one of those matters I think we should have the discussion about how we would reform. Let me conclude by just thanking Alan for the tremendous effort that we have seen here over these series. It is just remarkable taking the time and the diligence to take this together. Can I ask you to thank Alan, but I also want to invite him back up because he'd like to make, I think, an indication of where we're going from now with some of the work he's doing. So can we please thank Alan for his great work.
Thanks, John. This will be very quick. A group of us for the last couple of years have been looking at forming a group that might work across South Australia with a range of organisations and community groups, looking at ways by which we can refresh and renew democracy in this state and perhaps sort of work elsewhere in Australia. So the group's called DEM 36, and we've produced a charter which has got a whole series of ideas about an agenda for the kind of changes that might be thought about. Not many of the ideas are specific. They're suggesting these are areas that require investigation and discussion. And so over the next, 10 years, but we hope in the next couple of years we can go deep into working with other groups and looking at different ways in which South Australia can regain the reputation it once had as leading democratic practice in the world. Can I just, if you're interested in finding out more about the group, there's a QR code there. You just click on that and go for it. I see a few phones up. Thank you. Anyway, Dem 36. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan. I have one task to do, and that is to invite the Chair of the South Australian History Trust, Michael Neal, to bring things to a conclusion. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, John. I have two tasks to do, and one of them is to thank people and sum up and conclude the evening. The other thing is detain you all from your suppers. So knowing that the first is going to be much more popular than the second, I'll make the first brief. I would like to thank you all for joining us here for this evening for the fifth instalment of this wonderful, important lecture series by Professor Alan Reid. And I just want to say how fascinating it has been listening to Alan. I think Alan is a brilliant storyteller, and he's demonstrated that clearly tonight. I was going to probably start up and saying, it was a really interesting time in South Australia between Federation and the shadows of the First World War, the Great War. But Alan gave us something much more grounded. He related it to what was happening in the Australian cricket team. And he created his lecture, and I was thinking almost like a Methodist Wesleyan lay preacher, like two of his key characters, but instead he constructed a beautiful three-act play for us and gave us those wonderful characters, fleshing out John Jenkins, Richard Butler, Tom Price, John Verran and Archibald Peake. And they became characters in a story, and we got to understand what was driving them, what were their concerns, what were their issues. And they are the same, many of those things, as the concerns and issues that we all have today. And rightly, Alan has shown us the importance of being engaged in the process of democracy, protecting our democracy and improving our democracy. And I guess that's also the ongoing task of Democracy 36. So I would just like to thank, in addition to Professor Alan Reid, also Emeritus Professor Adam Graycar AM and also Professor John Williams for your contributions tonight. I would really like to also make a special mention to our wonderful partnership for this lecture series with the Stretton Institute at the University of Adelaide. And I'd also like to thank the team from the History Trust of South Australia who have worked so hard to bring this lecture series together tonight and hopefully ongoing in the future, supporting the work of Professor Reid. So my final thing is to say thank you for coming out tonight, for sharing this moment with us, and for being actively involved in our democracy. We look forward to seeing you at future events as we continue to explore the remarkable stories that have shaped our state and our democracy. Thank you for coming. Enjoy your suppers.